Now that we had a closer look at images, let's move onwards to linear gradients. For that, I'll go back to my main.css file and that background image we have on the starting page. Let's say we want to add a linear gradient instead of that image. Later we'll also combine it with the image, but for now let's use just the linear gradient. The first important thing you gotta know is that gradients, both linear and radial ones, are treated as images. So if you were to use the sub properties and not the shorthand, you would add a gradient by targeting background image with it, and then the part which I'll teach you in a second. Or in the shorthand version, you simply add it instead or additional to images because you can have multiple background images, not just one, but more about multiple backgrounds also at a later part. For now, let's simply override the background we set here with a linear gradient. We add one by using the linear gradient function CSS ships with. Now the linear gradient function consists of two parts in the end. You can add more than two arguments, but that simply is because you can define multiple colors across which you want to transition. But the first argument always is the direction of the gradient. You can omit it, in which case the first argument would be a color. So the simplest possible gradient is red-blue, for example. And if you save that, you get a gradient from red to blue. As you see, the default is vertically. So by default, it simply is a perfect line from top to bottom. And it transitions from red smoothly to blue. Now I just mentioned the first argument can be a color, but normally it's the direction. You can, for example, specify it like this, to bottom. This looks strange at first, but this is a syntax understood by CSS. It simply means that, from top to bottom. So you can save this and reload, and you get the same result as before. You can also say to left bottom. And now it will be a diagonal. Now you see it starts in the top right and goes to the left bottom. That's the transition. Of course, as you might guess, you could say to left top, to right top, and so on. And this simply defines where your colors start and where they go to. Now you can also define an angle with degrees. So you could say 30 degrees. And now your transition or your gradient would have a 30-degree angle. Now if you set it to 0 degrees, and you reload, you start at the bottom actually. So unlike the default where you start at the top, 0 degrees simply means a perfect line coming from the bottom. Therefore 180 degrees would be your default where you start at the top. And you can of course define any angle you want or use that to left bottom notation. Now, besides that, you can also define multiple colors, as many as you want, basically. So you can also add green, yellow, and orange here. Of course, you can not just use color names, you can also use hex codes. For example, for orange, you could also use that hex code here. And the same is true for RGB or HSL functions, you could use these too. So with that, if you now reload, we got a really colorful gradient. Now, I don't know if you need that on your next website, but it's nice to know that you can build that. A special gradient or a special way of using gradients is to also implement transparency. For example, you could transition from red to transparent. And if you do that, well, then you actually see we fade out to transparent, so we see whatever the background behind the gradient is. This is very useful for cases where you do have multiple backgrounds on top of each other. More on that later. You can of course also transition to a RGBA color, for example, like this, with some transparency inside of it. Now we would transition from red to this transparent black-gray color. This is how you can use linear gradients. You can do even more than that though. Besides specifying multiple colors, you can also define where these colors should start and stop. So let's add another color, let's say blue. And if you reload right now, you see each color gets 1/3 of the gradient. It's not that good to see because we go to that transparent gray, but actually the red color ends after 1/3, or put in other words, after 1/3, or after 30% to be precise, we got a perfect blue. And then after further 30%, that ends and we transition into the black part. Now you can split this up. You could, for example, say red should stay until 70%. Now if you reload, 70% of the gradient is red, a perfect red I should say, and then it transitions into blue and then the other color. Of course, you can also define stops here too. You could say 80% blue. This simply now means that after 80% of the gradient, the blue will already be done. If you enter a value smaller than the 70% of the red here, and you then reload, you see you got simply a hard edge because there's no room for transition, because when the blue part enters, it's already too late, to put it like this. It should have started at 60%, while it can only start after 70, but therefore there is no smooth transition. So this is how you can play around with the colors and how you can control when which color transitions into what. This is the linear gradient. We also got the radial gradient. Let's take a closer look at that in the next lecture.